The young and the restless spoiler's grief did not announce itself to Claire with the dramatic collapse she had braced for, but with a slow tightening of ordinary things, as if every routine action now required negotiation with a memory that would not move out of the doorway. And because the loss of Cole had come wrapped in the finality that only a hospital corridor can confer, she discovered that the world had the indecency to continue at its usual speed while the inner calendar froze around a single date. She tried to keep her breathing even, to honor the plea inside her chest that everything must be calm, measured, deliberate, because volatility had once been her native language and it had cost too much to keep speaking it. Yet calmness felt like an obligation she performed for others rather than a mercy she granted herself, and the more she repeated the word the more brittle it sounded, a glass bell protecting a storm. Cole had been the one person whose presence reorganized the chaos into meaningful patterns, not because he solved things but because his gentleness permitted the truth to sit unashamed on the table, and with his absence the house changed temperature, the rooms becoming either too large or too small, and objects she had never noticed, an old book with notes in the margin, a sweater that still held the impression of his shoulder, now conducted electricity through her hands. There was a voice in her that urged restraint, that reminded her survival is a long series of soft choices, and there was another voice, the one that wore Jordan's old perfume of contempt and strategy, telling her that suffering can be converted into leverage if you are willing to do what softer people cannot, and between those voices Claire felt like a bridge with too much traffic on it, trying to be both passage and barricade without collapsing into the river. She told herself that time would make decisions less heavy, but time was not cooperating, and into this fragile arithmetic drifted an image she resented on sight, Victoria laughing at something Nate had said. The kind of laugh that rings like a window opened in a stuffy room, a laugh that would be innocent anywhere else but here where the calendar had stopped and where laughter felt like a mistranslation of mourning. She did not want to be the arbiter of anyone's timeline. She had sworn to herself that she would not convert grief into ownership, but seeing her mother contemplate a beginning so close to an ending felt like disloyalty with good manners, and the orphaned parts of Claire rose up in reflex, tightening into judgment before she could name the judgment and take responsibility for it. The contradiction was galling. She loved Victoria and would not wish loneliness on her. She knew that humans in pain reach for warmth the way people shivering draw nearer to a radiator without asking for permission from the cold, yet she could not forgive what looked like haste, and under that irritation pulsed the older wound that Jordan had planted and watered, the wound that insisted love is a test you give to the people around you to see if they are smart enough to avoid your traps. And Claire, frightened by how familiar that sensation was, set herself the hardest task she has ever undertaken, which was to sit with the impulse and not convert it into a plan. Calm, she repeated, calm, and because she did not trust herself alone with that word she chose structures. Long walks that exhausted the body before the mind could start inventing narratives, journal pages filled without pauses so that the sentences could outpace the suspicion forming underneath them. Appointments with Sharon where language could be cleaned of its sabotage and grief could be described as a landscape rather than a weapon. Even so, the sight of Victoria's phone lighting with Nate's name, the knowledge that invitations were being drafted for dinners whose desserts would be served with cautious new jokes, the delicate theater of cautious affection that always follows a funeral, the choreography of consolation, pressed too insistently on the tenderest part of her chest, and she knew that asking her mother to pause would be an act as much for herself as for the memory of Cole, and the part of her that carried Jordan like a tattoo began enumerating the ways that pause could be enforced. It was not necessary to be theatrical, the old training whispered. It was enough to make certain calls, to remind certain boards of certain situations, to resurface articles that cast long shadows across hospital corridors, to write an anonymous letter that asked good faith questions about mixed priorities and patient trust, to leak a photograph deliberately taken from too ambiguous an angle, to schedule a delivery at a time that would coincide with a public appearance and then watch how distraction masqueraded as coincidence. In this moral spreadsheet, there were many cells that could be filled, and each promised an outcome that looked like justice but smelled like revenge, and the fact that it would keep Victoria safe was the lie that made the math pretty. She did not move on any of it. Instead, she scheduled a meeting with Nate at a quiet coffee shop where the beans were better than they needed to be and the staff knew how to be present without hovering, because she understood that wanting him gone and making him an enemy were two different projects, and she would not hand Jordan the satisfaction of seeing her swap truth for tactical advantage. She arrived early, sat where the light did not expose the tremor in her hands, and composed the kind of boundaries that do not threaten so much as clarify, yet when he appeared steady, eyes tired from the work of carrying other people's pain, clothes that still held the shape of long shifts, she felt an unanticipated pang of respect, which irritated her because respect is a poor companion to resolve. She explained herself without drama, keeping her voice low and her verbs exact, and his answer, though it refused her request, did not make a mockery of it, because he spoke not from conquest but from care, and care is infuriating when you need a simple villain to hang your decision on. He said, in essence, that he would not be a roadblock to a memory but a handrail for a woman navigating a precarious staircase, that he loved Victoria not as a replacement for Cole but as a man who believes love is not a pie with limited slices, and that he would rather be judged for presence than for retreat. The words did not soothe Claire, but they did something more durable, which was force her to audit the source of her anger and separate devotion to Cole from possession of her mother's future. She left the meeting with no concessions in hand and a fresh set of arguments trailing her like a cape, but she also left with the smallest proof that her worst impulses were not irresistible. She had managed to encounter a provocation, feel the old circuitry surge, and not become a circuit herself. In the days that followed, she tried to treat that restraint like a muscle, exercising it when invitations arrived that she would once have declined in the name of vigilance. She allowed herself to sit at a dinner where Nate's name was mentioned in a sentence that also included terms like helpful, gentle, and patient, and she listened without inserting barbed clauses. She visited the place where Cole had taken her to look at the sky through the canopy of a tree that allowed the world to be complicated without being threatening, and she let the air move through her without narrating it into significance. The clarity she sought did not arrive as revelation but as the absence of panic, a space where she could examine the diagram that Jordan had drawn inside her and notice that its lines were not sacred but habitual. She began to distinguish between the alarms that signaled danger and the alarms that signaled history, and the act of labeling them correctly loosened the knots that otherwise would have tightened around her choices. This did not mean the monster was gone. Monsters are often less creatures than customs, and customs do not die so much as they starve when you stop feeding them. There were nights when the old hunger woke her and painted vignettes in pleasing colors. A scandal that would tie Nate's hands for a quarter, a rumor that would attach like a burr to the hem of his reputation, a piece of evidence repositioned so that it said more than it had earned the right to say. On those nights she would sit at the kitchen table and write the plan as if she intended to execute it, every step, every call, every alibi, and then she would tear the plan, not dramatically, but into practical squares that she fed to the trash, reminding herself that discipline is less a vow than a sequence of small, boring refusals. There were truths she could not alter even with perfect behavior. That Victoria's capacity for love had not diminished because the world had taken someone from her, that her own loyalty to Cole would not become more real by policing someone else's timeline, that love does not become betrayal simply because grief has not finished drafting its terms, that Jordan's identity had been an implantation, skilled and precise, but not an inheritance, and that treating it as a birthright gave it a dignity it did not deserve. To keep these truths from becoming mere slogans, she enacted rituals. She organized Cole's papers with the carefulness of a librarian rather than the desperation of a forensic accountant looking for proof. She returned calls that she had been postponing when the ache was most eloquent, refusing to let pain be the project manager of her days. She sat with Victoria without asking the kinds of questions that are shaped like concern but aimed like accusations, and in that quiet discovered how much she had missed the ordinary grammar of being with her mother without a legal brief between them. It surprised her to recognize that Nate, in the pattern of his appearances, was not trying to colonize space but to be available in it. He did not force laughter into rooms where quiet was needed. He did not over-explain his intentions as if explanation could inoculate against human error, and he did not ask for permission to care, which would have made his presence a petition she could grant or deny and therefore control. He simply showed up with a consistency that felt more like devotion than strategy, and for someone like Claire, whose life had been a seminar in noticing strategy, that sameness was a discomfort she eventually learned to interpret as safety. Still, there remained a sharp edge she could not sand down. The image of Victoria and Nate as an orbit with its own language, an ecosystem that did not include Cole's gravity, and whenever that image bordered on accusation she tried to handle it with precision rather than heat, reminding herself that different griefs move at different speeds, and that the dignity she wanted for her own process was one she must extend to others even when her palms itched to close into fists. The test arrived one afternoon when a journalist reached out with questions too smart to be random, their interest in Nate's past threaded through with insinuations that had the polished gleam of opposition research. The old reflex flared, this could be used. This could be the gentle nudge that prevents a collision she has the right to prevent, and she felt the seductive physics of intervention begin to tilt her, but she did the unglamorous thing. She forwarded the inquiry to Victoria and wrote a plain note that contained no argument, only daylight, because daylight is what keeps fungi from becoming architecture. The relief that followed was not immediate, but it was real. She had passed the exam that Jordan would have designed with pleasure, and in passing it she learned that power can be practiced without violating anything. That influence does not have to be an act of theater to count. When she met Nate again, this time not to warn but to calibrate, she did not disguise her reservations, because honesty is not sabotage when it is offered without a desired outcome. She described what grief still demanded of her, the ways a too-soon joy can feel like theft even when it is not, and she asked him to be careful with the rituals that bound Cole into their shared house, not because he was a threat to them but because intimacy has a way of rearranging furniture and forgetting to ask where the heirlooms live. He listened, and the listening did not remove the ache but it dignified it, and dignity is sometimes stronger than analgesics. The world did not end. Out of habit she checked for consequences, but none arrived dressed as punishment. Instead there were small signs that the center was holding. A morning when she could look at a photograph of Cole without that involuntary clench that made her ribs feel like a fist. An evening when Victoria's laughter did not sound like betrayal but like breath returning to a room that had been sealed too long. A day when she ran into Nate at society and felt nothing dramatic at all, just the mutual acknowledgement of people trying to build without breaking. Through it all she remained vigilant about the shadow that Jordan had left in her, neither denying it nor bowing to it. She treated it like weather, checking it before making plans, packing for it when clouds gathered, refusing to blame it for choices that were hers alone. She knew better than to declare victory. Declarations invite tests, and she had sat through enough examinations to appreciate the value of quiet progress. There would be setbacks. Grief has a way of sending postcards from places you thought you had left. There would be mornings when the mirror returned the version of herself she loathed, the one that calculates rather than feels, and on those mornings she would reach, not for a plot, but for the phone, to call people who had promised to remind her she is not the sum of her worst competencies. When the first genuine celebration arrived, a foundation event honoring a project Cole had loved, she dressed without turning the act into a battlefield, allowed the compliments without weaponizing them, and stood beside Victoria as praise layered itself over absence. At the edge of the room Nate waited, not intrusive, not receding, and for the length of a song Claire felt the possibility that love in a world after loss is less about replacement than about resonance, and that to forbid resonance is to make a prison out of reverence. She went home that night and wrote to Cole, as she had been taught to do when speaking aloud was impossible, and in that letter she confessed everything. The anger that felt like loyalty, the control that masqueraded as protection, the quiet victories that no one would applaud because they left no visible mark, and the ongoing fear that she would wake one day and find Jordan's hand on the steering wheel. She also wrote about choices that had surprised her. Choosing to meet, choosing to warn without wounding, choosing to trust without surrendering skepticism, and she promised nothing except to keep choosing, because this, she finally understood, is how character is built in the rubble of catastrophe. Whether things would stop here was the wrong question. Nothing stops in a life, it only changes form, and the forms that mattered now were patience, boundary, candor, and the everyday endurance of letting others make their own mistakes without turning their mistakes into your morality play. Nate would continue to love Victoria in the unflashy way that professionals love, through presence, through patience, through familiarity that does not demand constant declarations. And Victoria would continue to negotiate the intersection of remembrance and risk with the grace that had always been her quiet strength. As for Claire, she would continue to live with the truth that healing did not make her ill.